A few weeks ago, I did a breakdown of what would happen if marijuana were to be rescheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. I went into sort of what it means, how it happens, what are the odds, and all that. And I'm going to link in the description below to that video. But I have had a chance to be in DC this past week, and I sat down with a lot of friends and colleagues, and I took a lot of the questions that folks put in the comments to that video, and I thought I would just do a breakdown of where things seem to be, what questions can I answer, and what's actually going to happen next. Well, hey folks, my name's Chris. I'm your host at Cannabis Policy and Politics. I have been a marijuana attorney. I have owned marijuana businesses. I've been a medical marijuana patient. I've been a felon after the DEA raided one of those marijuana businesses. Well, for the past 10 years, I have been an activist and a lobbyist looking to change laws around the country, both at the state and federal levels. And most recently, I've been watching as this whole news blew up around the FDA making its recommendation to change to Schedule 3. So let's do a quick breakdown on some of the responses I got. Let's take a look. Okay, just to recap where I ended up at the end of the last video, we are right now waiting for the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, to make its recommendation for where marijuana should actually land in the controlled substances list. Now, this is basically the system that we have in the United States for how we categorize drugs. Famously, marijuana is in the highest tier for that sort of drug categorization. It's called Schedule 1. And we now have a situation where the administration, the different agencies that work for the president, are now trying to think through whether or not marijuana should be moved. And one of the agencies, HHS, or really it's Health and Human Services, but it's also where the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, it's where the FDA lives. So FDA did its part. It made its recommendation, and now the DEA is trying to figure out what it's ultimately going to do. So doesn't involve Congress. We don't exactly know what's going to happen. And at the end of the video, I'm going to talk about what DEA is probably really thinking about more than anything else right now and what direction that could lead us. But in the meantime, there's all these questions about, well, what happens if it actually does move to 3? As I mentioned, I had a lot of great questions on my first video on rescheduling, and a lot of them were about drug testing. Now, if an employer has federal contracts, and so this would be particularly true in aviation, it would be pharmaceuticals or transportation. A lot of folks have federal contracts, or they at least want to be compliant with federal contract requirements. And this is because whenever the federal government goes out and starts setting up contracts with different types of businesses around the country, they very often will have strings attached. And they'll say, okay, well, then you're going to have to follow all of our rules. And a very common rule would be that your workers cannot be consuming illicit drugs. And so all this translates down to the fact that a lot of employers in the U.S. have what are now called zero tolerance drug policies. And so they just don't allow anybody to take drugs. And they do testing for a whole lot of them. And so the question is, well, if it moves from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, does the federal government now not care as much about marijuana? And so we could see a big change when it comes to what their requirements are for all these contracts. Unfortunately, it's not going to be quite that simple. There is no direct line that would say, or law or rule that would say, if it's scheduled to, a certain point, then it just sort of drops off the list for tests. The list of naughty drugs that they actually look for in those drug screens is kind of random. I mean, they're not just the Schedule 1. They'll have, drugs from all over, from 1 through, probably 4. And so now, while it's not a sure thing, you have to kind of consider that over the past several years, we have heard every now and then about federal agencies that maybe don't care so much about past drug use, especially with marijuana. And so there was already a little bit of thought like that going on. And then now we would have, assuming it happens, rescheduling. And I think, and the folks I talk to all think, that there's a pretty good chance that these different federal agencies that go around and assemble these lists of drugs they look for in drug tests, maybe they're just going to decide that's not quite as serious. And there's always been this little bit of pressure because the more people that live in legalization states, the more people are going to show up on these drug tests. And that means fewer qualified people for these jobs. So hopefully coming out of this, we're just going to see kind of a de-escalation when it comes to drug testing requirements, but there's no sure thing, and we're definitely going to have to pay attention to see how that develops. Well, while we're all wondering if the administration might just adopt this rule, Congress is actually considering a piece of legislation that would do just that by changing the law. It's called the Cannabis Users Restoration of Eligibility Act, or CURE Act, and it was presented in the House of Representatives. It was Representatives Jamie Raskin, Nancy Mace, and Earl Blumenauer. And so they put this bill up. It went to committee, and just this last week, I think it was just this last week that committee voted yes, and now I think the next step is for it to go to the floor of the House for a vote. So Congress is kind of showing support for this issue. Agencies have been kind of sort of backing off a little bit over the past few years. So maybe we're just kind of seeing a general de-escalation when it comes to things like drug tests. And I have to say I'm super appreciative of the folks who have really been working on that for a while. And I have to say it sure sounds like things, we're at a point where we can see things change. Now, another thing that I heard about that's pretty exciting is that for veterans who were discharged in some way other than honorable, if it was because they ended up showing positive on a drug test, the fact that it was at one time Schedule 1, which because it's Schedule 1, it means it has no medical value, and then instead would be now thought of as Schedule 3, that means there's medical value. And that means that you might be able to be in a situation where you could go back and get that discharge reevaluated to say, look, there was medical use going on there, and that could change things. So again, this stuff's really early. We haven't seen it tested, and I'm just talking to people who've been thinking about this, all this stuff in DC. I definitely hope to get an interview with a veteran who's very familiar with this issue. And so I hope to have that as a future episode, and we're just going to take a deep dive into all the many, many really egregious things that happen to our veterans when we're talking about marijuana. And I knew only about a few of them, and so I'm really excited to sort of really understand better what's going on and share that with you all. So good news, at least on that front. And just like I was saying with the drug tests a little while ago, where agencies are kind of now probably starting to think about what the right way to treat marijuana is, VA has always been under pressure to rethink its rules. And you got to think that if they're going to move it from 1 to 3, opening up now, hey, acknowledging that there's some medical value here. Again, you got an agency, you got people that are making decisions, and we could see them start to find ways to get more access or to allow doctors to have more free conversations with their patients about this. So we're just going to have to keep paying attention, but it's another one of those areas where I was getting a lot of good ideas and people wondering what's going to happen. Okay, just a couple of other things. I had a conversation with a very well-known attorney for the cannabis industry. His name's Bob Hoban, and he thought of a couple things that I hadn't even begun to consider. One is that businesses right now that are in the marijuana business they cannot actually declare bankruptcy under the federal system. The federal government considers all this stuff illicit, and so they deny those businesses access to the federal bankruptcy system. And so by moving from 1 to 3, it is possible that things could change. I don't think we know yet, but it's one of those things where it would at least make it a little bit more fair. Another sort of similar thing would be whether or not businesses can actually get a trademark. So just like bankruptcy, marijuana businesses can't get a trademark in, say, their company name. So totally unfair, but it is the way that it is. And it's also possible that that will open up. So there are a couple of interesting ways that this could change for business. Now, when it comes to banking, another one of the sort of problems for businesses is the cost that goes with banking services. This is because of federal requirements that basically say, hey, banks, we're not going to, necessarily come after you for working, as a criminal enterprise working with these marijuana guys, but you're going to have to jump through a whole bunch of hoops and do extra reporting and all this sort of stuff back to the federal government. And these are often referred to as SARS reports. And so SARS reports are very expensive. They get built into the cost of banking for businesses. And the question is going to be whether or not the federal government goes back and decides, maybe we don't need the SARS reports anymore. So there are a couple of actual ways that this could help businesses in various sort of indirect but still important ways. Well, that's it for the questions I was able to cover on this last trip. I'll definitely keep an eye open in the comments to see if there are any others that maybe I can answer. But I wanted to talk just briefly about where we're at in the process. So DEA has gotten its recommendation back from the FDA. Nobody has seen that letter. We don't actually know exactly what the FDA said. They just told us in public that they made a recommendation. And so it's now up to DEA. I don't think there's any particular expiration date on, how long they have. But like I said in the last video, we're still thinking it's going to be by the end of the year. By the way, that process, almost certainly we would expect that there will be lawsuits. Somebody somewhere is going to have a problem with this whole process, and there'll be a lawsuit. So it's hard to say how long the whole thing will go, but there will be additional steps. There will be a point at which DEA will ask for public comment on any changes that it's going to make or new rules, and then they'll review those comments and then ultimately make their decision. So we still have a few steps to go. Now, when it comes to what are they going to actually do? Of course, that's a huge question right now, but there's kind of two schools of thought. One is they're going to do basically what I predicted in my last video, which was they're going to give Joe Biden what he wants. Merrick Garland sits on top of, he's the head of the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice is where the DEA actually resides. And my thinking was pretty simple. I don't think Merrick Garland's going to be the guy to not give the president what he wants. But of course, we don't know what's going to happen. And there are folks who will argue that DEA is definitely not going to go to 3. They're going to go to 2. Now, I've been talking about how in our system of laws in the Controlled Substances Act, you've got all these different tiers or schedules for drugs, and marijuana is at the top. You've got 5 of them, however, and the specific recommendation from Health and Human Services, or the FDA, was to go from 1 to 3. Now, everybody thought that was a big deal that's in the marijuana business community because that would alleviate a huge tax burden that everybody pays simply because of the fact that the federal government considers all this stuff completely illicit. And so they pay literally about an 80% tax on their income, which is just insane. And so this change was sort of praised because of the fact that it would eliminate this tax code provision, and it's called 280E. So now, as I said, the DEA can make whatever call it's going to make, and we don't know if it's going to agree exactly with Health and Human Services. They could say that instead of moving to Schedule 3, they'll just go to Schedule 2. So the problem with that is that that tax code provision would still be in effect. If it moves to 2, it's really no change at all. And for some perspective, methamphetamine is in Schedule 2. And so clearly the DEA is still busting down doors for businesses like that. So no real change. So when people in DC are speculating about, well, what's the DEA going to recommend, it really comes down to whether or not they're going to seek Schedule 3 or they're going to actually just go to Schedule 2. So a lot of drama around that question. So as the DEA is considering all of this, it's this internal process, there are certain things that they need to keep in mind. And one of those things isn't the internal politics, it's not what the president wants, it's not what the public wants, it's not even necessarily what Health and Human Services wants, it's what are our international treaty obligations. And haven't really talked about that before. But what's happened is the United States signed on to what's called the Single Convention for Narcotics. Now, I've mentioned in the United States, our system for regulating drugs comes through the Controlled Substances Act. Internationally, it comes through international treaty, and that's the Single Convention. And in it, it says that states who agree to cooperate when it comes to international drug law enforcement agree to abide by certain areas of conduct, and one of them is that they're not going to violate themselves the whole point of making these drugs illegal. And so there are a lot of folks who are concerned that UN treaty would limit the United States from just saying, well, we're just now going to allow it for recreational use, because recreational use is not a thing internationally. There are only certain things that people are really allowed to do with drugs, and really the primary one is medicinal. Not medical marijuana, but medicinal, more like the FDA. So there are a lot of folks who kind of look at this and think, not sure, because it's the FDA's responsibility in sort of considering its response to take into account what this international treaty obligation would require. Now, I have to think that we have been at this since 1996. That is, we have been changing state laws, allowing people to have access for various reasons that would never comply with the UN treaty. And so to sort of pull that out now as a showstopper, to me, I think would be pretty sketchy, and I can't imagine, but hey, you know what? I can't imagine. So it's the debate. Let me put it that way. We don't know what the DEA is going to do, but it often sort of hinges on where you think they'll fall on the international treaty. So we're going to have to see. If you like this video and you want to see more like it, I've got a bunch more on my YouTube channel. And often my videos get age limited by YouTube. I haven't figured out why in some cases and not in others, but it is what it is. But the best way to stay current on any videos that I publish is to hit subscribe. And like is very much appreciated as well. All right, folks, that's it. See you next time.